There are towns that shine on postcards, quiet streets, painted porches, flags swaying gently in the sun. But beneath the charm, some places rot from the inside out. Not with noise, but with silence. Not with chaos, but with control. In Westridge, justice wore a uniform, but not a conscience. People disappeared into reports that never saw daylight. Complaints faded like chalk on the sidewalk, and the ones who dared to speak learned to whisper or vanish. But one woman didn't vanish. She returned. Not as a victim, as their new chief. They didn't recognize her when they threw her to the ground. They didn't ask her name. They should have. Now it's too late. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Tell us in the comments. She didn't expect trouble that day, just fuel, maybe a bottle of water, and the quiet hum of the road continuing beneath her wheels. But as Naomi Ellis pulled her rented SUV into the lone gas station on the edge of town, a silence hung heavier than the heat shimmering off the blacktop. The place looked ordinary enough. 2 cracked fuel pumps, an ice machine with faded lettering, and a flickering neon open sign, barely clinging to life in the convenience store window. She stepped out slowly, letting the thick, humid air wrap around her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl, her sneakers crunching faintly on loose gravel as the pump beeped to life. She was dressed plainly black travel pants, a loose cotton shirt, and a pair of dark sunglasses resting atop her head. But something about her presence seemed to fracture the stillness. As she reached for the gas nozzle, she noticed a patrol cruiser in the corner of the lot, angled just enough to suggest it hadn't pulled in for snacks or a quick break. 2 officers sat inside, eyes fixed in her direction, unmoving. Naomi's back straightened unconsciously. She'd lived this moment before too many times, in different cities with different uniforms, but always the same quiet calculation behind the glass. The pump clicked as the tank filled. She kept her breathing, even told herself they had no reason at all. But then the cruiser door opened slow and deliberate. Out stepped a broad-shouldered man in mirrored sunglasses, hand already resting on his belt. His partner followed, younger, leaner, with nervous energy twitching through his fingers. Naomi turned toward them with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years navigating fragile egos dressed in authority. "Afternoon," the older officer said, voice-clipped eyes scanning her rental plates before drifting back to her face. "This? Your vehicle, ma'am?" Naomi nodded. "Yes. Is there a problem?" The younger one tilted his head, smirking slightly. "Mind if we ask what you're doing out here?" "I'm fueling my car," she replied gently, making sure her voice neither rose nor faltered, "and then heading on my way." The pause that followed was longer than necessary. The older officer glanced back at the cruiser, then toward the store's entrance, perhaps checking for witnesses, perhaps just stalling. Naomi felt it in her chest first, that low throb of instinct honed over years of service, the quiet shift, when a conversation is no longer just a conversation. "We've had reports," the officer said finally, "of a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity along Highway 22. "That's odd," Naomi replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I just picked this up from the rental agency at the airport 3 hours ago. You're welcome to check the paperwork in the glove compartment." Neither of them moved to verify. Instead, the younger one stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You live around here?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He crossed his arms. "So what brings you back?" Naomi hesitated. She could have said she was visiting, or that she had a meeting, or offered one of the 1,000 neutral answers that might de-escalate this into nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding. But a part of her refused. "Not this time. Not again." "That's personal," she said simply. The older officer didn't like that. His jaw tightened. "License and registration, please." Naomi nodded, moved slowly, deliberately toward her purse on the front seat. "I'm reaching for my wallet," she said aloud, a practiced habit born from too many headlines and funerals. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The younger one snapped, his voice sharper, now more performative. She froze. "They're right here," she said, raising both palms in the air. "You asked for ID. I'm complying." The air around them had changed. She could feel it, see it, in the way his partner's stance shifted into that of someone preparing for something louder, more violent. Naomi's heart beat slower but harder, like it always did when the situation began to tip. "This doesn't feel routine," she said quietly. The older officer chuckled under his breath. "Ma'am, your attitude isn't helping." "And what exactly am I being stopped for?" she asked again, more firmly now. The younger one stepped beside her door hand, hovering over the latch. "Step out of the vehicle. I'd prefer to know why first," she replied, her voice level but steel threading underneath. Out he barked, and this time, without waiting for consent, he yanked open the passenger door. Naomi didn't resist. She knew better than to give them anything that could be twisted. She stepped out, hands still, visible body language, neutral but strong. She glanced around, no other customers, no cameras. She could see just the open stretch of two-lane road and the low buzz of power lines overhead. "I'm going to show you my badge," she said. "We're not playing games," the older one snapped, cutting her off. Against the vehicle. "Spread your legs." A sharp pulse ran through her spine. Naomi obeyed, saying nothing. The metal of the SUV pressed against her thighs, warm from the sun. She could feel the younger officer behind her, could hear the way his breath hitched as he began to pat her down. "I do not consent to a search," she said clearly. "Smells like something in the car," the older one muttered, already circling toward the passenger side. "There's nothing in that vehicle," she said. "I'm a law enforcement professional. If you'll allow me to retreat." The blow came without warning. An elbow or maybe a hand to the back of her head, slamming her forward into the hood. The metal scraped her skin, warm blood already trickling near her temple. "You're under arrest," one of them muttered, as if saying it made it true. For what she whispered, her voice hoarse. Resisting came the reply, flat and mechanical, like a line read too often. As they twisted her arms behind her back and fastened the cuffs, Naomi stared at the cracked windshield of her own car, watching her own face reflected faintly in the glass, calm, composed, bleeding. And somewhere inside her, beneath the pounding of her heart and the roar of injustice blooming again, where it never truly left, she thought, "They have no idea who I am. And by the time they find out, it'll be far too late." They didn't ask her name, not once, not even as they shoved her into the back of the patrol car, face still slick with blood and wrists pinched raw from cuffs that had no business being that tight. The older officer, the one with the mirrored sunglasses and gravel in his voice, slammed the door shut without looking at her, then adjusted his belt like he'd just done something important, something righteous. In the driver's seat, his partner mumbled something about getting her booked before the shift change, like she was just a task to tick off a list. Naomi sat perfectly still, eyes forward, heartbeat steady. But underneath that stillness ran something deeper, more volatile, something she'd kept buried for a long, long time. The air inside the cruiser smelled like stale sweat and disinfectant, and every bump in the road sent a pulse of pain through her skull. She could feel where her temple had split open, the skin tacky and wet, and her thoughts drifted not from dizziness but from the sheer absurdity of what was happening. The irony wasn't lost on her, how easily the uniform could disappear when you weren't wearing it, how quickly your credentials meant nothing when your skin told a different story. She'd worked her whole life to be seen as more than what the world assumed at first glance, and yet here she was again, reduced to someone they didn't bother asking questions about. They brought her through the back of the precinct, not because protocol demanded it, but because that way fewer people would see her. The hallway buzzed under flickering fluorescent lights, the kind that never seemed to stop humming, and as they marched her past empty desks and closed office doors, she noticed how casually other officers glanced up and looked away. One or two gave quick nods of approval, as if what had been done to her out in that parking lot deserved a pat on the back. No one asked if she was all right. No one asked anything at all. At the booking desk, a heavy-set sergeant with a stained clipboard and a thinning hairline barely looked up. "Charges?" he asked flatly, chewing something invisible between his teeth. Resisting possible narcotics possession, maybe intent to distribute, the younger officer said, still breathing harder than he needed to, like the adrenaline hadn't worn off. Naomi turned her head slowly toward the sergeant, her eyes clear despite the swelling. "I am a law enforcement officer," she said, voice calm but firm. "You're making a serious mistake." The sergeant finally looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze pausing longer than necessary on her blouse, now stained from both blood and sweat. "That right," he muttered. "Got a badge in your purse, do you?" "In the glove compartment," she replied. along with departmental ID and letters of clearance. I suggest you verify that before continuing." He smirked, didn't move, didn't write anything down, just shook his head slowly and said, "We've heard better lies." And that was it. Just like that, her truth was dismissed with the flick of a pen and a shrug. They led her to a small interrogation room that smelled of bleach and old tension. The walls were painted a pale yellow, probably meant to be calming, but it only made the place feel sickly. Her handcuffs stayed on even after she was seated. They didn't offer water, didn't address her wound, didn't treat her like someone with rights. She noticed the mirror on the wall, the kind that only reflected one side of the story, and wondered how many eyes were watching her now, how many of them already believed the narrative that had been wrapped around her like barbed wire. The older officer returned with coffee, but only for himself. He sat across from her, leaned back in his chair, and sipped slowly like they were having a friendly chat. "You from the city?" he asked casually. She didn't answer. He took another sip. "We don't get many of your kind out here," he added, letting the sentence hang loaded and ugly. She tilted her head slightly, blood still drying along her cheekbone. "My kind?" she asked, not angrily, just tired. He smiled, thin and joyless. "You know what I mean. Folks who think they can come out here and tell us how to do our jobs." Naomi exhaled slowly, eyes locked onto his. "What I think," she said, her voice low, steady, measured, "is that you've made assumptions you're not prepared to answer for." He chuckled, looked down at his phone, then back at her. "We'll see." Hours passed. Different officers came and went, some trying to play good cop, some not bothering to play anything at all. They asked about drugs that didn't exist, people she didn't know, stories they were trying to wedge her into like a pair of shoes a size too small. Through it all, she gave them nothing, just her name, her request for medical treatment, and her right to contact an attorney. Every request was denied or delayed, every truth she offered treated like a lie. By the time they finally moved her to a holding cell, the sun had dropped low enough to paint the walls with long shadows. Inside, 7 others were already crowded along metal benches, black-brown, a couple with visible bruises, one elderly man coughing into his hands. The smell of old mop water and tension hung in the air like fog. Naomi sat down beside a young woman with braided hair and weary eyes. "What you in for?" the woman asked quietly. Being black on a Tuesday, Naomi almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. "Something like that," she replied. "Name's Naomi." Letitia, the woman said. "I was waiting for the bus outside the coffee shop. Loitering," they said. Naomi looked around the room at the quiet faces lined up like pieces on a board someone else was playing. She felt the weight of every story in that room, stories that had been silenced, twisted, ignored. And for the first time since the gas station, a thought settled into her bones, not just cold or painful, but righteous, burning, and clear. They didn't ask her name because they didn't think it mattered, but they were about to learn who she was, and everything was about to change. The air inside the holding cell was thick, with the kind of silence that didn't feel accidental. It had weight, like a blanket soaked in everything unsaid. Naomi sat against the cinder-block wall, her hands still cuffed behind her wrists, aching from hours of pressure that no one had seen fit to relieve. The gash on her temple had crusted over dried blood running in a jagged trail down her cheek, and despite her request for medical attention, the only thing they'd offered was indifference. She tried to shift her body into something more comfortable, but the metal bench offered no grace, no space, just cold steel pressing against bone. Around her, the cell was a tapestry of quiet suffering. 7 people, all people of color, all held for reasons that sounded more like warnings than crimes. An elderly man wheezed softly with every breath, one hand clutching his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the moment. A college-aged woman in a hoodie sat curled into herself, a dark bruise rising along her jaw like a shadow trying to speak. No one complained, not out loud, because complaining in a place like this was its own kind of risk, and everyone here knew better than to tempt the people holding the keys. Letitia leaned closer, voice low but clear. They left that old man like that all day. He asked for his heart meds 3 times. Naomi's eyes moved to the man watching the slow, shallow rise of his chest. "They're not gonna help," Letitia added. "Unless you scream or bleed enough to make a mess." Naomi nodded, once taking it in. "What did they charge you with?" she asked. Letitia shrugged. "Loitering. Disorderly conduct." I sat on a bench with my coffee too long, apparently. There was a tired laugh in her throat, the kind that had nothing to do with humor. Naomi turned her gaze upward toward the security camera mounted in the corner, the red light blinking slowly like it was bored by all the suffering it failed to register. She knew that camera, knew the model, knew its blind spots. It was designed to record everything and prove nothing. In her mind, she started cataloging names, badge numbers, procedural violations, the exact time her rights had been denied. It was muscle memory now, this gathering of facts, while the wounds were still fresh, while the lies were still settling into their rehearsed rhythm. An hour passed, maybe more. The officers outside the cell moved with deliberate slowness, their footsteps echoing down the hallway with a kind of casual cruelty. Once the younger cop Collins she remembered passed by with a smirk, not even bothering to look inside. Naomi watched him go, expression unreadable. She didn't need revenge, she needed proof. The clank of keys against steel broke the stillness as the door opened briefly and the sergeant from earlier entered with 2 new officers in tow. He scanned the room like someone shopping for trouble and settled his eyes on Naomi. "You," he said, pointing with his chin. "Time to talk." 2 officers flanked her without a word, lifting her by the arms as though she weighed nothing. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Letitia gave her a slight nod as she passed a gesture that said, "Remember what you saw." They brought her to interrogation room. 3, smaller, darker, colder than she remembered it being in any department she'd worked for. There were no windows, no clock, just a metal table and a chair bolted to the floor. The mirror on the wall reflected back a version of herself she didn't fully recognize. Bloodied, bruised hair disheveled from the scuffle, eyes still sharp but rimmed with exhaustion. She sat down, slowly, testing the cuffs against the chair back, ignoring the sting that followed. Officer Rayner entered first, the weight of arrogance practically slung across his shoulders. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and sipped from a styrofoam cup like they were old colleagues catching up after years apart. So he said casually, "You ready to be honest with us now?" Naomi tilted her head. "About what exactly?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Where you got the dope? Why you were acting nervous? Who you're working with?" He said it all like he was bored with the answers before she even gave them. Naomi let the silence stretch until it felt uncomfortable for him, not her. "There are no drugs," she said calmly. "And I wasn't nervous. I was cautious. There's a difference." He smiled tight, joyless. "You're gonna play this the hard way, huh?" "I'm not playing anything," she replied. "I've asked for my phone call. I've asked for medical attention. I've asked for my attorney. You've denied me all 3. You've also conducted an unlawful search and filed a false report. I've documented everything." His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a flicker of hesitation behind the confidence. Naomi leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure he heard every word. "You may think you're writing the narrative, Officer Rayner, but stories have a way of correcting themselves." The door opened again, and Collins stepped in, holding a clipboard and a small plastic evidence bag containing her wallet, keys, and cell phone. "Nothing came up on the prints," he said, not quite meeting Rayner's eyes. "No priors. No active warrants. Vehicles clean." Rayner took the clipboard, barely glancing at it before tossing it on the table. "She still assaulted an officer," he muttered. "I didn't," Naomi said firmly now. "And you know that." Rayner stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. "Back to holding," he barked. Collins hesitated. "You want me to log her statement?" Rayner shot him a look sharp enough to slice. She didn't give one. As they pulled her from the chair and led her back through the hallway, Naomi's mind moved like clockwork. The cracks were showing. Collins wasn't all in. There was doubt now floating just under the surface. And in a place like this, where control was everything, doubt could be just enough to start a fracture. Back in the cell, the others looked up as she returned, their faces worn but attentive. Naomi sat beside Leticia again, slower this time, her body starting to register the cost of everything she'd endured. Leticia glanced over. "You all right?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes, took a breath, then opened them with something clearer inside. "No," she said quietly. "But I will be." Because what they didn't understand yet, what they never thought to imagine, was that the woman they had dragged through their system, humiliated and bruised and bloodied, was the one person uniquely qualified to burn the whole thing down and rebuild it in the name of something better. The morning air outside the precinct was dense with the smell of hot concrete and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clings to tired cities and tired people settling deep into the seams of uniforms and skin. Naomi stood in the narrow hallway just off the main briefing room, still in the same clothes from the day before, though someone had finally removed the cuffs, and a kind nurse probably pulled in from the county clinic had cleaned the blood from her temple and taped a thin gauze pad over the wound. Her hands ached, her joints stiff from hours in holding, but none of that showed now. She stood tall, her back straight, her gaze calm but resolute, as if nothing about this moment surprised her because deep down it didn't. She could hear voices through the thin wall, low chatter, the shuffle of chairs, a burst of laughter from someone oblivious to what was about to unfold. The daily shift briefing was in full swing, with officers gathered in the room like they always did, sipping coffee from department mugs, checking their phones, and leaning into habits formed by years of routine and unchecked power. They had no idea what was coming, and Naomi, with her badge in her hand and a manila folder under her arm, was about to walk into that room and turn their entire world inside out. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open, but the sound wasn't loud enough to command attention, not right away. She stepped inside slowly, deliberately, her presence quiet but unmistakable. The room was rectangular rows of chairs facing forward, and at the front stood Sergeant Daniels mid-sentence, holding a clipboard and looking up just as she entered. His words stalled mid-air, and for a long second the room remained suspended in stillness. Conversations stopped, mugs lowered, heads turned. Naomi didn't need to speak to command attention. It happened automatically, like gravity, something elemental and irreversible. Every eye turned toward her, and as the recognition dawned, the shift in the room was almost physical. Officer Rayner was sitting in the third row, legs stretched out arrogantly in front of him, but now he sat up straighter, squinting slightly as if his eyes didn't trust what they were seeing. Next to him, Collins went rigid, the color draining from his face so fast it looked like someone had unplugged him from the wall. "Good morning," Naomi said, her voice calm and firm, cutting through the silence like a wire. "My name is Dr. Naomi Ellis. I am your new interim chief of police." No one moved. No one breathed. For a moment, the room seemed to forget what oxygen was. She let the silence settle before speaking again, each word measured but warm, like a teacher who didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. "Some of you already know me," she continued, "though you may not have known who I was at the time. Yesterday I was arrested by 2 of your officers at a gas station on the east end of town. I was searched without consent, physically assaulted, denied medical care, and falsely charged. A few officers shifted in their seats. A cough escaped from the back corner, but no one spoke." Naomi held up the folder. "Inside this file are the findings from an independent oversight audit of this department's arrest, record stop and search procedures, and use of force complaints over the last 18 months. The pattern is deeply troubling, and as of today, this department is under full administrative review." She placed the folder gently on the lectern, then locked eyes with Rayner. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, but he didn't say a word. Naomi didn't flinch. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, "but I am here for change. Real, measurable, enforceable change. And for those who believe that accountability is a threat rather than a responsibility, I suggest you reconsider your position." Sergeant Daniels cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Chief Ellis, if I may, this is all very sudden. The department wasn't notified. The mayor's office will be issuing a statement later today," Naomi interrupted without raising her voice. "But my appointment is effective immediately. I've been tasked with restoring integrity to this department, and that begins now." She let her gaze move slowly across the room, taking in each face, the nervous, the skeptical, the hardened. Some of them looked away. A few stared back with quiet hope. And a handful, she could tell, were already calculating how to resist her authority without making it obvious. Still, she kept her tone even. "There will be no mass firings today, no dramatic shakeups for now. What I expect is simple cooperation, professionalism, and the willingness to confront the culture that's allowed misconduct to flourish here unchecked. If that's too much to ask, my door is open for resignations." No one stood up, no one left, but the temperature in the room had changed. the casual arrogance, the smirks, the lazy posture, it had all evaporated. What remained was something else: uncertainty, caution, maybe even a flicker of respect. Naomi gave a small nod, then stepped away from the lectern. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a speech. What she needed was time and the chance to move through this building not as a suspect or a stranger, but as its highest-ranking officer. As she walked toward the hallway, she passed Rayner, who muttered something under his breath. She paused, just long enough to glance down at him. "You had your chance yesterday," she said softly. "Now it's mine." Then she walked on past the faces that had watched her, bleed past the hands that had cuffed her, and into the role they never thought she would occupy. Not because she wasn't qualified, but because they never imagined a woman like her could hold that kind of power. But Naomi Ellis wasn't imagining anymore. She was just getting started. The corridors of the precinct felt different now, quieter, but not in the way peace feels quiet, more like the hush of a storm gathering out of sight, pressing against the walls, heavy and expectant. Naomi walked those hallways like she'd been there for years, though every step reminded her she hadn't, that she was still something unfamiliar in a place built on routine and resistance. Eyes followed her wherever she moved, not openly hostile, not entirely respectful either, just calculating like the department itself was waiting to decide whether she was real or just a passing disturbance in their long-established current. Behind closed doors, the whispers had already begun: who she was, what she wanted, why she was here. Some called her a plant from the state, others whispered about quotas and political agendas, but Naomi ignored all of it because she knew the real reason they couldn't stop watching her. She hadn't broken. She'd walked in through the same door they'd dragged her through, not as a victim, not as a threat, but as their chief. And that fact alone disturbed the foundation more than any speech or memo ever could. Her office, small, windowless, still smelling faintly of old furniture, polish, and nervous sweat, offered no comfort. The desk had been left exactly as the former acting chief had kept it, neat on the surface, disorganized underneath like the man himself. She stood for a moment behind the chair, letting her fingertips rest lightly on the backrest, absorbing the space, the weight of what it meant. Then she sat down slowly, quietly, and opened the drawer to find the personnel files she'd requested the night before, 43 pages, each name printed cleanly across the top, each file thicker than the last. She flipped through them one by one, not skimming, not rushing, just reading. Patterns emerged almost instantly: repeated use of force reports against Black and Latino men with the same justifications repeated word for word. Body cam footage listed but missing from final entries. Internal complaints marked resolved with no follow-up documentation. It wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration, tight, deliberate, systematic. The phone on her desk buzzed once, cutting into the silence. Chief Ellis said, the voice on the other end steady but cautious. "There's someone here to see you, Officer Pope. She says it's personal." Naomi paused for only a second before answering. "Send her in." Officer Marcia Pope entered with her hands clasped tightly in front of her eyes, flicking once toward the closed blinds and then back to Naomi's face. Young black, barely 30 Pope wore the uniform like it was armor, every inch of her posture pulled taut by something more than duty. Naomi gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit," she said gently. "Tell me what you've been carrying." It took a long moment before Pope spoke, her voice low and steady, like someone walking across a frozen lake. "There's a culture here, Chief," she began, "and it runs deeper than most realize. Some of them, Rayner Daniels, even a few on night patrol, they've created a kind of code, an inner circle. If you speak out, things go missing, shifts get reassigned. You end up in situations that feel dangerous." Naomi didn't interrupt. She let the silence encourage truth, nodding slowly as Pope continued. "They don't call it a gang, but that's what it feels like. There's this phrase they use when they talk about cleaning up the streets, protecting the image of the town. But what they really mean is keeping people like me and you out of sight, unless we're in cuffs or on foot." Naomi folded her hands together, elbows resting on the desk. "Why tell me this now?" Pope looked down briefly, then met her gaze without wavering. "Because when I saw you walk into that room yesterday, I realized someone was finally in a position to do something. And because I'm tired of keeping my head down. There was a quiet strength in that admission, a kind of bravery that didn't need applause to be felt." Naomi nodded again, more firmly this time. "Then we start here. With you. With truth. With the records they thought no one would look at." Outside, the station moved at its usual rhythm: radios, crackling boots, pacing linoleum phones, ringing in bursts. But inside that office, something had shifted. Naomi knew the resistance would come, that the challenge wasn't simply changing procedure, but disrupting a culture that had shaped itself around silence, hierarchy, and fear. But she also knew that the first crack had formed, and sometimes that's all it takes. After Pope left, Naomi stood and walked slowly to the hallway window overlooking the parking lot. The cruiser that had taken her in the day before was parked in the same spot, its number still etched in her mind. She stared at it not with anger but with clarity, because this wasn't just about her, and it never had been. It was about every person, like Pope, like Letitia, like the coughing man in holding whose medication sat ignored. Behind her, the precinct hummed with tension, a building holding its breath. But Naomi Ellis had already exhaled, and she wasn't going anywhere. The precinct after hours had a strange rhythm, quiet but not restful, more like the hush that follows a lie told too easily. Naomi stood alone in the records room, the hum of old fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her as she flipped through rows of manila folders stacked tightly in metal cabinets. The air smelled of aged paper and dust, stirred by movement, and each time she opened a drawer, the metal screeched faintly like something protesting the act of being seen. This wasn't busy work, and it wasn't for optics. This was where the story lived, in paperwork, filed to be forgotten, in signatures placed without conscience, in language designed to sound official while hiding violence behind protocol. She had rolled up her sleeves, not out of comfort but necessity. There was a heat that clung to the room, thick and low, and the weight of what she was reading pressed against her shoulders like a burden made of years. Her fingers moved quickly but precisely, pulling incident reports, complaint files, internal memos, with red ink stamps that read, "Reviewed" or "No action taken." She wasn't looking for a single smoking gun, she was building a pattern, and the pattern was everywhere. Same officers, same neighborhoods, same outcomes: bruises, silence, dismissal. Behind her, the door creaked softly, but she didn't turn. She knew who it was before the voice came. "I figured I'd find you here," said Pope, her voice a little softer now, more familiar, more certain. Naomi turned slowly and gave her a small nod, gesturing toward the growing stack of files on the table. "How bad is it?" Pope asked, stepping closer, her eyes already scanning the paperwork without touching it. Naomi let out a breath, low and steady. "Worse than I thought. Some of these officers have a dozen complaints over the last 2 years, and not one disciplinary action. Not even a temporary suspension." Pope exhaled and folded her arms. "That sounds about right." Naomi looked at her, studying the curve of her jaw, the way her shoulders carried more than a shift's worth of stress. "You ever file a complaint?" she asked gently. Pope hesitated, then nodded. "Once. A partner made a comment on patrol, said if the wrong kind of people moved into his neighborhood, he'd personally help them back out." Naomi tilted her head. "And what happened?" "Internal Affairs said there wasn't enough context to determine intent." Pope replied, her voice carefully flat. "The next week I was reassigned to desk duty without explanation." Naomi nodded, not surprised but still affected. She returned to the stack, pulling one particular report and holding it up. "This one's about Rayner," she said. "Same complaint, wording different names. 2 different officers, same night. Same justification, resisted questioning. Neither report includes body cam footage, even though policy requires it." Pope leaned in her eyes, scanning the headers. "He calls it the playbook. I've heard him joke about it." Naomi's expression didn't change, but something hardened just slightly around the edges. "He's not joking anymore." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The files sat between them like evidence laid bare on a courtroom table, waiting for someone to stop pretending it wasn't real. Naomi closed one folder, then another, stacking them neatly before straightening her back. "I want a full audit of all use of force incidents over the past 3 years, she said, her voice low but firm. "And I want the names of every complainant whose report was dismissed without a follow-up interview." "You'll get pushback," Pope warned. "From everyone, top brass union reps, even the mayor's office. They'll say, you're going too far too fast." Naomi looked her directly in the eye. "They've had decades to go slow. Now it's our turn." Pope didn't argue. She simply nodded and walked out of the room, her footsteps steady, her presence no longer unsure. Left alone, Naomi gathered the reports and placed them in her bag, careful not to crumple or bend a single page. These papers were more than just evidence. They were stories, pieces of lives reshaped by abuse and denial. And for each one, she knew there were 5 more that had never been filed, buried instead in silence and fear. She turned off the light as she exited, leaving the room as quiet as she had found it, but now with a sense that something in it had been seen. Back in her office, the air felt cooler, almost watchful. She closed the door behind her and locked it, then opened her laptop and began cross-referencing dates, badge numbers, locations. The spreadsheet she was building grew steadily, each entry a thread she could later pull, each cluster of complaints, a warning sign the system had long chosen to ignore. Outside the windowless walls of her office, the precinct continued its rhythm: phones, ringing radios, spitting static shoes, echoing down hallways. But inside, Naomi worked in silence, lit only by the glow of her screen, and the slow realization that this wasn't just a corrupt department. It was a machine, built not just to protect power but to punish dissent, to disguise discrimination as discretion, to transform prejudice into policy and call it policing. And it had run unchecked for far too long. She didn't feel overwhelmed, though. She felt focused, like someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for a storm that had finally arrived. The weight of the badge on her desk felt different now, less like a symbol and more like a tool. A lever, if you knew where to place it. A soft knock came at the door. Naomi checked her watch. It was well past 10. She opened the door slowly, finding Collins standing there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I just wanted to talk." Off the record, Naomi stepped aside and gestured toward the chair. "Then sit and start at the beginning." Because she knew when silence starts to break even in whispers, it means the truth is looking for a way out, and she was going to help it find the light. The town hall sat like an old relic at the edge of the square, its red brick facade weathered by time and politics, its flag hanging motionless under the dull gray sky of a Thursday afternoon that felt heavier than most. Naomi climbed the stone steps slowly, the leather of her boots whispering against each surface, as if testing the ground, as if measuring how deep the rot might go. She had been summoned, not invited, by a brief email from the mayor's assistant, a meeting that urgently required her input but bore no real courtesy beyond its urgency. The message carried the weight of a formality masking discomfort, and Naomi could feel it before she stepped inside. This wasn't a discussion, it was a warning wrapped in polite paper. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and distant tension, the kind that sits between walls during election seasons and budget negotiations. The receptionist barely looked up as she passed, clearly instructed not to engage, and the mayor's assistant, a thin man in a slate-gray suit that seemed too large for his frame, led her toward a small side conference room without saying more than they're inside. Naomi nodded, didn't press, just adjusted her coat and prepared herself for what she already expected, an attempt to pull her off the tracks before she gained too much speed. The room was modest but designed to impress: high windows filtered in afternoon light that made everything look softer than it was, and a long mahogany table sat at the center like an altar to controlled conversation. Around it sat 3 members of the town council and Mayor Grace Whitfield, a woman whose public smile had graced every charity, gala, and ribbon cutting in the county, but whose eyes now revealed something less polished, unease mixed with calculation. Chief Ellis, the mayor, began gesturing toward the chair directly across from her. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Naomi took the seat without hesitation, folding her hands in her lap and offering a calm nod. "Of course, Mayor. What can I help you with?" The mayor exchanged a quick glance with Councilman Blake Haynes, a man in his early 60s, with a face that looked carved from granite-deep lines, pulling his features into a permanent expression of suspicion. He cleared his throat before speaking. "We've been hearing some concerns, Chief, from officers, from residents. Concerns about your leadership approach." Naomi didn't flinch. "Could you be more specific, Councilman?" Haynes leaned forward slightly, his cufflinks catching the light as he steepled his fingers together. There's been talk of aggressive internal audits, surveillance of long-serving officers, calls for reopening closed misconduct files. These kinds of actions risk destabilizing public confidence in the department. Naomi let that hang for a moment before replying. Respectfully, Councilman, I would argue the lack of accountability is what damaged public confidence to begin with. Mayor Whitfield offered a tight smile, her tone trying to soften the edges. Chief, we understand your desire for reform, but we also have to consider the larger picture. Westridge has always prided itself on being a quiet, orderly town, the kind of place where people feel safe. And yet, Naomi replied evenly, in the last 18 months alone, the majority of civilian complaints have come from just 3 zip codes, none of which are represented in this room. That pulled a visible shift in the mayor's expression, the kind of defensive flicker that comes when someone realizes the narrative is slipping out of their hands. Haynes, however, wasn't finished. Let me be frank, he said. Some of us feel your approach may be unnecessarily adversarial. This department doesn't need to be torn down to be fixed. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but charged with quiet certainty. It's not being torn down. It's being cleaned out. There's a difference. Whitfield raised a hand as if to mediate. Let's not get caught in semantics. We're asking for a shift in tone, Chief. Perhaps a pause in these audits until we can establish clearer communication between your office and the council. A pause. Naomi repeated softly, her eyes narrowing just enough. You're asking me to slow down the investigation into racial misconduct and departmental abuse to preserve appearances. The mayor hesitated. We're asking for balance. We're asking you to consider the political landscape. Naomi felt the weight of that word political, and all the years she had spent watching that word be used like a scalpel to cut truth into more acceptable shapes. She rose slowly, the chair legs making a soft sound against the floor. With all due respect, Mayor Whitfield, I wasn't hired to manage appearances. I was brought in to fix a system that's been protecting itself instead of the people it serves. Haynes scoffed under his breath. Be careful, Chief. You don't want to alienate the very people who can end your tenure before it truly begins. Naomi turned her eyes toward him, not angry, not shaken, just unwavering. And you should be careful assuming I came here to protect a career. I came here to do a job. Silence followed her as she walked out of the room, her footsteps measured, but firm, her spine straight, even as the storm gathered behind her. She didn't need their permission to keep moving forward. What she needed, and had, was the truth, and it was a sharper tool than anything they could throw her way. Outside, the sky had darkened, a slow wind curling through the trees, as though it too sensed the shift. Naomi paused at the top of the steps and took in the stillness of the square, the way people moved with quiet purpose, the way the town looked peaceful if you didn't know where to look. But she knew, and now they knew, she wasn't going to stop looking. Not for appearances, not for comfort, not for them. The morning sunlight had barely stretched across the precinct parking lot when Naomi stepped outside, her footsteps steady, her mind already working 3 moves ahead. The air held that early stillness only found before the day's noise takes hold. Birdsong mixed faintly with the distant hum of traffic, a calm that almost fooled her into believing she had time to breathe. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder bag, filled now with documents and statements collected the night before each page. A thin sliver of truth that together formed the outline of a system buckling under its own secrecy. It wasn't just paperwork, it was weight, and she felt every ounce of it. Her vehicle sat under the same cracked floodlight, as always clean, anonymous, unremarkable by design. But something in her gut shifted the moment she got within a few feet. It wasn't anything obvious, no smashed window, no slashed tire, just the faintest hint of gasoline in the air and a dark stain that ran beneath the car, slick and unnatural, against the pale concrete. She crouched slowly, eyes narrowing as her hand brushed the damp surface, then moved to trace the underside of the frame. A clean slice across the fuel line. Intentional. Precise. Designed to leave her stranded or worse. She stood without speaking, eyes scanning the lot. A patrol car idled near the far exit windows, tinted engine too quiet. No one moved inside. Naomi didn't need to approach. She'd seen that particular brand of silence before. It was the kind used by men who wanted you to know they were watching without ever having to say a word. She turned back toward the building, walked inside without breaking stride, and found Pope already waiting near the lobby, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets, her eyes tense but alert. "They've started," Naomi said flatly. Pope nodded once. "We figured they would." In the back of her mind, Naomi recalled something an old instructor once told her during a federal training exercise in Quantico. "The most dangerous part isn't when the pushback begins, it's when they feel you won't stop." That was where they were now. Past warning shots, past intimidation, entering the part of the story where people stop pretending and start reacting in the dark. And that meant every step forward would carry its own shadow. By mid-morning, her office had become a hub of quiet motion files, exchanged timelines, checked background reports, uploaded onto encrypted drives, each action measured and secure, each conversation shortened to what was essential. The team around her, still small but growing in courage, worked like people who understood that time wasn't on their side. Pope coordinated a schedule for off-site witness interviews. Collins, still cautious but steadily engaged, brought in printouts of arrest records marked with red flags Naomi hadn't even requested. And Naomi, at the center of it all, moved like a woman with purpose stitched into her spine. It wasn't until she sat down to review footage from an external dashcam, an angle that confirmed the unlawful detainment of a teenager weeks prior, that her phone buzzed sharply across the desk. The number was blocked. She answered anyway. There was no voice at first, just the low background noise of an idling engine and what might have been a police radio murmuring in the distance. Then a click, then silence. She hung up without speaking. Not even 2 minutes later, an internal dispatch rang out through the station Unit 35, requesting backup fire reported at Vehicle Compound Lot B. Naomi's eyes met Pope's instantly. They didn't need to say it. By the time they reached the rear, lot smoke was already rising into the morning, sky dark and oily and fast-moving. Flames consumed 2 vehicles, both impounded patrol cars tied to pending investigations. Naomi stood at the edge of the scene, her jaw tight, the reflection of fire dancing in her eyes. Officers moved in a half-circle around the blaze, none of them in any real rush to contain it. She could hear someone mutter behind her, "Electrical fault, maybe." Another voice answered, "That's what the report'll say." Pope stepped beside her, voice low. "This wasn't just to destroy evidence." Naomi nodded, her voice even. "Number. It's a message." The air around them pulsed with heat, but it wasn't just from the flames. It came from the tension pressing in from all sides, the kind that made everyone stand a little too still, talk a little too soft, and avoid eye contact just long enough to avoid being part of what came next. Naomi turned back toward the building, walking slowly now, the weight of fire and silence trailing behind her like a second shadow. Back in her office, she closed the blinds, locked the door, and sat in the chair with her hands folded on the desk. She let herself breathe, just once, deeply. Then she reached for her phone and dialed a number that, until now, had remained unused, written on a slip of paper she'd kept in her wallet since before she arrived in Westridge. "Agent Hamilton," she said when the line connected. "I need to talk. They've escalated, and I don't think they plan to stop." There was a pause, then his voice calm and familiar. "Tell me everything." Naomi looked toward the window, where smoke still curled upward into the sky, and replied quietly, "This department isn't protecting itself anymore. It's fighting to survive, and it's willing to burn everything in its path to stay the same." And with that, the real work began. Rain had started to fall sometime after midnight, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that muted the sound of tires on pavement and made the whole town seem quieter than it really was. Naomi stood near the front entrance of the precinct, just beneath the awning, her coat pulled tight against the damp air, watching drops roll down the windshield of her department-issued SUV. It had been a long night, an even longer week, and the storm outside somehow mirrored the one still moving quietly beneath the surface of everything she'd touched since arriving. There was a strange beauty to it, though, the way the streetlights shimmered on wet concrete, the way the town seemed to hold its breath before the sun came up. Inside the building hadn't slept. Paperwork passed between hands like whispered secrets, and the small team Naomi trusted had worked in quiet shifts, analyzing, comparing, connecting threads others had buried or forgotten. It was Pope who first identified the pattern arrest reports with matching language identical phrasing that repeated over months, sometimes years. Phrases like uncooperative attitude, furtive movements, unconfirmed narcotics, odor terms that sounded official but were often used as placeholders for racial profiling and unlawful escalation. Naomi had read dozens of them, then hundreds, her chest tightening with each repetition until she could predict the next sentence before turning the page. But patterns weren't enough. They needed proof. Real, irrefutable, undeniable proof. That's when Collins knocked on her door, holding a flash drive and an expression that said he hadn't slept either. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, something in his posture more tense than usual, a hesitancy behind his eyes that told her this wasn't just data, it was confession. "I found something," he said, simply placing the drive on her desk. From the backup servers, surveillance files, patrol car footage, internal comms. Naomi studied him carefully, noting the tremor in his fingers, the exhaustion in his face. "Why now?" she asked softly, not as accusation but as truth-seeking. He sat down slowly, shoulders hunched like someone carrying more than his own shame. "Because I've been quiet too long. And because if I don't speak now, I'm part of it." She nodded once and plugged in the drive. The footage was raw, unedited, time-stamped, and damning. Officers laughing during a late-night traffic stop where a young black man had been pulled from his car for failing to signal. A patrol unit disabling their body cams before entering a low-income neighborhood, followed by a string of questionable arrests. A voice Rayner's bragging on a radio channel about getting the numbers up before the end-of-month report. Naomi leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of it all pressed down again. But this time it wasn't helplessness. She felt it was certainty. This was no longer just a hunch or an audit trail. This was something the world would have to see. She called Pope in immediately, then reached out to her federal contact, Agent Hamilton, who had been quietly following her progress from the outside. "We have enough to open a case," she said without hesitation. "Not just against individuals, but against the culture itself." Hamilton didn't respond right away. Then came a simple, measured reply. "Start pulling the thread. We'll follow." By morning, Naomi had organized an emergency strategy session with her internal allies, Pope Collins, and two other officers who had expressed quiet support but hadn't yet stepped into the light. They gathered in her office just before dawn, the room dimly lit by desk lamps and the blue glow of evidence charts projected on the wall. "This is the moment where everything breaks open," she told them, voice steady but low. "But once we do this, there's no turning back. They will push harder. They will fight dirtier. You have to be certain that you're ready." Pope nodded first. "We've already crossed that line. Now we finish it." Collins looked less certain, but his voice didn't waver. "I'm with you. Just tell me what to do." Naomi outlined the plan: targeted interviews with prior complainants who'd been dismissed without cause, synchronized delivery of evidence to state oversight officials and trusted media contacts, and a formal internal memo that would trigger a mandatory ethics review of every officer in leadership. They would time it all with precision, ensuring no opportunity for the opposition to suppress, reframe, or bury what was coming. As the meeting ended and the group dispersed to begin their respective tasks, Naomi lingered by the window once more, watching the clouds shift and break into pale morning light. The rain had stopped, but everything still glistened like the town had been washed just enough to appear clean, but not enough to truly be so. She didn't fool herself into thinking this would end with a single exposure, or that arrests and resignations would fix what had taken years to grow. But what she did know with clarity as sharp as the wind on her face was that silence was no longer an option, and that for the first time the department's walls were beginning to echo with the sound of something unfamiliar: accountability. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the bullpen, a few heads turned away quickly, others stayed locked to their screens, but she noticed something new in the room's energy. A few officers stood straighter. A couple nodded, not out of politeness but out of recognition. Something had changed. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. As she approached the locker room, she passed Rayner without speaking. He didn't acknowledge her, but his eyes flicked toward her with something she hadn't seen before, not arrogance, not smugness, uncertainty, and that she thought was the first crack in the wall. She kept walking her pace, steady her thoughts, sharp her heart unshaken. Because the truth was no longer hidden in files or whispered behind closed doors. The truth was walking the halls now, and it had her face. The sky over Westridge was a muted gray that morning, the kind of dull overcast that made everything look quieter, heavier, like the town itself had exhaled and was waiting for something it couldn't name. Naomi stood just inside the entrance of the community center gymnasium, her arms crossed over her chest, watching as a group of plainclothes officers moved purposefully through folding chairs and quiet conversations, setting up equipment that looked more like a federal operation than a community event. The morning had started early, too early, but no one complained. Everyone here knew what was at stake. At the far end of the room, a table was set up with bottled water notepads and a microphone that would never be turned on. This wasn't a press conference. It was something quieter, more surgical a moment, designed to catch corruption in the act without the noise of headlines or handshakes. Naomi walked to the center of the floor, adjusting the small recording device pinned to the inside of her blazer, then nodded to Pope, who stood near the rear entrance already watching the parking lot through the glass. "You sure they'll take the bait?" Pope asked, voice low, barely audible. Naomi didn't hesitate. "They already have." The setup had been simple in its concept but delicate in execution. A staged community de-escalation, training open to all officers, especially those from night patrol. The invite was public enough to seem routine, but specific enough to reach the right ears. Inside, the equipment had been tested, the footage cross-checked, the hidden cameras placed where no one would think to look. But what made it possible, what made it all real, was what Collins had handed her the night before. "It's all there," he'd whispered, sliding a flash drive across her desk. Timestamps, GPS logs, radio chatter, even the body cam Rayner thought he deleted. Naomi had played it on mute, watching, frame by frame, as Rayner and two others pulled a teenage boy from a convenience store parking lot, pinned him against a cruiser, and stuffed a bag into the back seat. No audio was needed. The expressions, the movements, the laughter, it was all clear, and with that the trap had been set. At exactly 9:43 a.m., the side door opened. Rayner entered first, flanked by two other officers. Naomi recognized immediately from the footage Carson and Dean. They walked in like they owned the air around them, shoulders, squared eyes scanning lazily over the room before settling on the front table. Rayner gave a half smile to one of the volunteers, then leaned in close as if he were whispering a joke. Naomi didn't move. She watched them settle into their chairs near the front, casually flipping through the printed agenda like it mattered. Then came the cue, a short tone over the intercom, followed by a voice Naomi knew well, Agent Hamilton. "Everyone please remain seated," he said calmly. "This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. You are not under arrest yet, but you are being detained for questioning." The room shifted instantly. Officers froze mid-motion, a coffee cup dropped and rolled loudly across the floor, and Rayner's smile vanished like breath in cold air. Carson stood up instinctively, but three federal agents had already stepped in from the hallway, each one moving with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Dean's mouth opened, but whatever he intended to say died, as Pope stepped forward, her badge visible and firm. Naomi moved toward the front, her voice steady and quiet. "We have evidence that shows deliberate misconduct, coordinated deception, and falsified reports tied directly to individuals in this room." Rayner's eyes narrowed, flicking toward her like a cornered animal. "You set us up." "No," Naomi said softly, "you set yourselves up. We just hit record." The agents began escorting the three men from their seats, their hands hovering near cuffs but not yet used. The room remained tense, but no one moved to interfere, not this time. Something had cracked in the walls of Westridge's silence, and the noise that came after was finally one of consequence. Outside, the federal SUVs waited with back doors already open, engines idling softly in the background like punctuation marks to a story too long ignored. Naomi followed them out at a distance, standing just beneath the low-hanging clouds, as the doors clicked shut behind the officers who had for so long written the rules unchecked. Pope came to stand beside her, arms folded. "That felt real," she said. Naomi nodded. "Because it is." The rest of the day passed in motion. Statements, collected files, secured calls, made to confirm protocol. But even in the blur of activity, Naomi could feel something different under her skin. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the end of pretending. The end of asking nicely. That night she sat alone in her office, the only light coming from the lamp on her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of her badge as she looked at the names on her latest report. Officers, suspended officers, pending investigation officers, still pretending nothing had changed. She reached for her pen and began drafting the next phase of her plan. Because now, they knew she wouldn't flinch. Now they knew she wouldn't stop. And now, finally, they believed her. The council chamber had never felt more crowded, though not because of the number of people inside. It was the weight of what was coming, pressing against every polished surface, pooling in the corners, where ambition and silence had once made comfortable homes. Naomi stood just outside the double doors, taking in the muffled hum of anticipation from within the shuffle of feet, the soft rustle of papers being adjusted nervously on wooden benches. It wasn't the noise itself that unsettled her, it was the fact that this time people weren't whispering about her behind her back. They were waiting to hear what she had to say, and that kind of attention came with its own cost. The air was cooler inside the chamber, air-conditioned to maintain calm during heated public debates, but it did nothing to slow the pulse in her throat as she stepped forward, each stride deliberate, each step echoing off the marble tile. She didn't need a podium or a microphone to claim the room. Her presence did that for her, the calm steadiness of someone who had walked through fire, not untouched but unbroken. Councilman Haynes sat at the end of the semicircle, eyes narrowed beneath his silver brows, his fingers steepled like he was already preparing his rebuttal. Mayor Whitfield sat more composed, her expression unreadable, her hands folded atop the packet Naomi had delivered that morning. Dozens of pages of documented misconduct, falsified arrests, and direct failures in oversight tied to members of the very council she now addressed. Some faces looked away as Naomi began. Others couldn't stop watching her. "I'm not here to perform," she said, voice level calm. "And I'm not here to ask for approval." She placed a slim folder on the table before her. "What I'm here to do is tell the truth. Not the one you've rehearsed, or the one you tell yourselves in meetings behind closed doors, but the truth that's been documented, recorded, buried, and now unearthed." She paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "For the last 4 weeks, we've been conducting a comprehensive review of internal police reports, arrest records, civilian complaints, and surveillance footage. What we found is not isolated. It is not incidental. It is systemic. There was a shift in the room, the shuffle of papers, the straightening of shoulders, the tightening of jaws. In just the past 2 years, Naomi continued, 74 formal complaints were dismissed without follow-up. 19 internal investigations were closed without interviews. Body cam footage was disabled or went mysteriously missing in 11 use-of-force incidents, all involving Black or Latino residents. She didn't look at Haynes as she said it, but she could feel his glare sharp and expectant. And this council, she added, signed off on funding proposals, disciplinary approvals, and promotional recommendations tied directly to those involved. Mayor Whitfield cleared her throat. "Chief Ellis, these are serious accusations." Naomi didn't flinch. "They're not accusations, they're documented facts." The tension in the chamber cracked like a pane of glass under pressure. Whispers rose from the public gallery. A reporter in the second row scribbled frantically. Councilwoman Reyes, a quiet figure until now, leaned forward and whispered something to the mayor, who kept her eyes fixed on Naomi. Haynes finally spoke, his voice low but cold. "What are you suggesting we do, Chief? Tear the department down? Start over from scratch?" Naomi took a breath, not rushed, not defensive, just sure. "I'm suggesting we stop pretending this town is immune to the same failures we see across the country. I'm suggesting we finally stop protecting the structure more than the people it was supposed to serve." She opened the folder again and pulled out a list of names. "These are the officers under formal review. These are the complaints that never reached your desks. And these," she turned the page, "are the residents who were failed by your silence." The mayor shifted in her chair, her political polish beginning to crack. "Chief, we have to consider the public response. Business, confidence, voter trust, media scrutiny." Naomi interrupted gently. "With respect, Mayor, the public already responded. They filed complaints. They marched. They asked for answers. You didn't listen." There was a stillness, then quiet, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. The kind of stillness that comes when the truth has landed and no one knows where to look. Naomi scanned the faces before her. This isn't about shame, it's about responsibility. The choice is yours. You can lead the change or be remembered for resisting it. The silence held for a moment longer, then cracked open with the rustling of movement, council members whispering aids, handing over papers, people beginning to realize that the room would not leave the way it entered. As Naomi gathered her materials and stepped away from the center table, she didn't need applause or acknowledgement. What she had were facts, and facts had power. She walked back down the aisle, her footsteps steady, her shoulders straight, and as she passed the press bench, one young reporter leaned toward her and whispered, "Thank you," for saying it out loud. Naomi gave the smallest nod, then stepped out into the hallway where the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. She paused there just for a moment, letting the warmth touch her skin like something earned. The fight wasn't over. The hardest part still waited. But the door had opened, and this time it wasn't going to close. The sun rose gently over Westridge that morning, casting a pale gold light across the rooftops, washing the town in a softness it hadn't earned but maybe, just maybe, was beginning to deserve. Naomi stood in front of the precinct in her uniform, newly pressed the silver badge on her chest, catching the first light of the day. Though it wasn't the metal that felt heavy, it was everything behind it. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs as she looked around at the quiet neighborhood, waking slowly around her joggers, crossing at the corner, a city bus rolling past with its familiar hiss, a mother holding her child's hand as they waited to cross the street. It was a scene she'd seen 1,000 times in 100 cities, but today it belonged to her in a way it hadn't before. Behind her, the precinct buzzed with restrained energy. Desks shuffled, phones rang, and radios murmured between hands holding coffee and clipped tension. The leadership transition was still raw. Some officers had resigned. Others had been removed quietly. No ceremony, no press. A few remained defiant, holding on to old grudges like rusted tools, but even they were quieter now, uncertain. The energy had shifted, not because of one speech or one arrest, but because the silence had finally been broken and could no longer be reassembled. Inside, Pope stood at the whiteboard in the conference room, outlining the revised patrol rotations with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her place, not with noise but with steadiness. Collins, once cautious, now worked alongside internal affairs, cross-referencing archived footage with witness testimonies. Officers who'd once kept their heads down had started to speak up, and though not everyone celebrated the change, they understood it was here to stay. Naomi watched it unfold, like someone watching a forest regrow after fire. Nothing rushed, everything real. At mid-morning, she made her way to the south wing past the row of lockers that had once echoed with casual mockery and backroom deals. Now it felt different. As she passed, several officers straightened subtly, not in fear but in acknowledgement, an unspoken gesture that said, "We see you now." She gave a small nod in return, not because she needed their approval, but because respect once earned through silence was now being exchanged with presence. Down the hall in the community room that had been recently repurposed, a quiet dedication ceremony was underway. No fanfare, no television crews, just a few rows of folding chairs, a podium, and a framed display that hadn't been there the day before. Naomi approached slowly, her footsteps light on the freshly cleaned tile, her eyes drawn to the glass case at the center of the room. Inside was the blouse she had worn on the day of her arrest, still stained faintly with blood near the collar, still creased from the hours spent in holding still, a memory stitched into every inch of its fabric. Beneath the case, a small brass plaque read, "Justice delayed is not justice denied. We remember where we began, so we never return there again." For a moment she stood alone before it, hands resting at her sides, the quiet around her, holding her like a breath that hadn't yet been released. Then she heard the voice of a child, soft, unsure. "Are you the chief?" Naomi turned surprised, but not startled, and found a little girl standing with her mother just inside the doorway. The girl was no older than 7, wide-eyed and clutching a sketchbook, her voice barely louder than the hum of the lights above. "I am Naomi," said a smile beginning to find its place. "And you?" The girl hesitated. "I drew this," she said, holding out a page from the book, crayon lines forming a stick figure in a blue shirt with a silver star. "It's you!" Naomi knelt down to accept the drawing, her fingers gentle, as she took it, heart unexpectedly tight in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's perfect." The mother gave a quiet nod, her eyes saying more than her words ever could. Then they turned and left, leaving Naomi standing there, holding a piece of paper that weighed almost as much as everything she'd carried to get to this moment. Later in her office, she tacked the drawing to the wall beside the framed certificate of her appointment. It looked small there, surrounded by polished plaques and official seals, but it was the one thing she would never take down. As the afternoon faded into evening and the precinct began to empty, Naomi sat at her desk with the door open, the sounds of the building softening around her. She thought about all the things they still had to fix: hiring practices, civilian review panels, data transparency, and she knew none of it would happen overnight. But it didn't need to, because the foundation was no longer rotting. It was rebuilding, and this time it had her name on it. Outside, the last light of the day curved across the sidewalk like a path drawn just for her. And Naomi Ellis, chief of police, stepped forward without hesitation. What this story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see the cycles, is that real change doesn't come wrapped in speeches or headlines. It comes quietly at first through one person who refuses to look away, through truth, uncovered page by page, through courage, not just to confront injustice, but to stay and rebuild what was broken. Chief Naomi Ellis didn't set out to be a hero, she set out to do her job. But doing the right thing in a system designed to protect itself takes more than a badge. It takes character clarity and a commitment to something bigger than self-preservation. And that's the lesson here for all of us. No matter how invisible we feel, our actions matter. Our silence or our voice can shape the future for generations. Whether you're on the front lines or quietly witnessing from the sidelines, you have power to question, to listen, to vote, to support those who fight for truth even when it's inconvenient. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on something you've seen or lived through, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video so others know it matters. Share it with someone who needs reminding that justice isn't out of reach. And if you believe in stories that restore dignity and demand accountability, subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing them to light together. Because some stories aren't just worth telling, they're worth remembering.